Welcome to another episode of The Unseen Paranormal, where some of the scariest things are unseen. I'm your host, Eric Freeman. Hey everybody, welcome back to The Unseen Paranormal. Today we are chatting with author, monster hunter, and cryptozoologist Lyle Blackburn. You may know Lyle by his signature black cowboy hat and his appearances on Monsters and Mysteries, Finding Bigfoot, Strange Evidence, and numerous other TV shows and documentaries. Lyle has written several books, including Sinister Swamps, The Beast of Boggy Creek, and Boggy Creek Casebook. You can find Lyle's books on Amazon, Kindle, or at his website, lyleblackburn.com. Welcome to the show, Lyle. Thank you for joining us today.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
So I always like to ask the origin story because I'm always interested in how people got into, especially like cryptozoology or even paranormal investigating, because everybody has a different story and different experiences. So how did you get into monster hunting and cryptozoology and come to write these books?
Well, for me, it kind of started early on as a kid. I gravitated towards horror movies and monsters and things like that early on. And at some point I saw the Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot film and, some stories on Loch Ness on TV. And then I got a book when I was in elementary school that had stories about the Yeti and Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot. I really was fascinated with those because, in my mind, it was like, wow, this isn't a Hollywood movie. This is, something you might encounter in real life. And then I saw a movie called The Legend of Boggy Creek, which dramatized sightings of a southern Sasquatch creature much closer to where I live. I live in Texas, and that happened in southern Arkansas, and the movie was based on real cases. So that just sort of stuck with me. Later in life, I became a musician and did a lot of touring and things like that, and I would just, follow cryptid sightings as best I could and read books. And later on, I began to write for the horror magazine Rue Morgue. And I kind of got the idea that I wanted to write my own book, and that kind of just resulted in me thinking, what's my favorite subject, or what case would I want to investigate? And that was The Legend of Boggy Creek. So that became my first book, The Beast of Boggy Creek. And then from there, it just sort of happened on its own. I got calls from Monsters and Mysteries in America and was on a couple of their season 1 episodes, and then became a story consultant for them and appeared on some other shows, and people responded well to the books, and I love doing the research. So I just continued from there to write more books, and then eventually do some work with small town monsters out of Ohio for documentary films and things like that. So ever since then, I'm just doing what I probably wouldn't have ever thought I could do as a kid, like, oh, I'm going to be a monster hunter. Who says that or whatever.
Right.
So, it's great that all that has happened.
Yeah. And you said you first got interested with the Beast of Boggy Creek, and you've written quite a few books about Boggy Creek. But what is the legend behind that, and what is the Beast of Boggy Creek? Right.
Yeah, that particular case goes back many, many years, and the creature is essentially described as a Sasquatch-like creature. Has sort of a southern type profile, I guess. It's a little more hairy. It's more aggressive, and of course, the places it's said to live would be in the Sulphur River bottoms of southern Arkansas. It's more of a swampy bayou kind of area. This is an area that kind of is a triangle where Texas and Louisiana meet Arkansas. And the first sort of public knowledge of the creature came to be known in 1972 when some people moved into this small town of Fouke, Arkansas, near Texarkana, and began experiencing some strange things creeping around this house where they were living, and that culminated with some sightings of an upright, hair-covered creature. And eventually they got a shotgun and tried to shoot it, and it attacked one of them, and one of them ended up in the Texarkana hospital. And then, of course, that got into the news and was printed in the newspapers and so forth. And then others came forth saying, well, this isn't the first time we've had incidents or sightings of a creature fitting this description. And then stories started coming out that had never been publicized. So these were sightings that had occurred in the 60s and 50s and 40s and on back. And those newspaper articles inspired a would-be filmmaker by the name of Charles Pierce, who was living in Texarkana. He began wanting to do a documentary on it called Tracking the Fouke Monster, and it was named the Fouke Monster after the little town of Fouke. And it later became the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek, which is sort of a horror docudrama, almost like the first found footage type horror film that debuted in 1972. And it was a huge success in the 1970s. I mean, it played in drive-ins and theaters for years and made millions of dollars off of just basically an independent film made in Arkansas. And that gave that particular Southern Bigfoot case a much higher level of recognition and notoriety than others. And so, many people know about that if they've seen the movie or if their parents have told them about it. But there had never been a book written on, what are the facts behind it? How was the movie made? What are all the stories? And that's when I entered to do the investigation and sort of put all that story together. And then I discovered, sightings had gone back even as far as like 1908. So I've written, several books kind of revolving around that just simply because there's so much to the case and because it's rather popular just from the movie notoriety.
Yeah, and with those sightings going back to 1908, are they all pretty much similar sightings of kind of the same creature?
They're pretty consistent. People have different descriptions of hair color and sometimes the height. But, that would only make sense because if a creature like this exists, it most likely there must be a population of them, like any pockets of Bigfoot creatures, and not just a single individual that's living for hundreds of years, just like Bigfoot. People who don't know the subject often say, how can Bigfoot be seen in all these different places? Well, logically, there would have to be more than one. So, but in general, the described very consistently, and it walks upright, and it has ape-like features, yet, is walking on two legs like a human, hair that sometimes covers its face, and allegedly has a howl that pierces the night. It's, just something that when you start looking at these old reports, especially preceding people's knowledge of Bigfoot, even in 1972, people in Arkansas didn't think Bigfoot. They weren't sort of seeing something in the forest and translating into, whoa, we saw a Bigfoot.
Right.
They didn't have any frame of reference, so they would describe it as, looking like an ape or a gorilla, whatever they could compare it to, which kind of makes it, to me, more credible because they weren't really influenced by, the Bigfoot culture that would come in the later 70s and on.
Right, and those people didn't have anything to gain by reporting this either. If anything, they probably had a lot to lose.
Absolutely. There's all kinds of people who say, that was made up for this reason or that reason, but really, why would somebody go, let's make up this monster? And, it did bring people to the town. Just the newspaper articles brought hundreds of people up there, yahoos with shotguns and six-packs, and they're going to hunt the monster. And then when the movie came out, you can only imagine this little town of Fouke had about 500 people living there, and there's now a hit movie. There was more people coming there to hunt the creature than the people lived there. They were tromping all over the people's property and carrying guns, and it was a big problem for the Miller County sheriffs and the local police force.
Yeah, and I like that you found reports going back to 1908 because a lot of people, would want to jump in, like skeptics would want to jump in and say, well, this legend's just been around because they made that movie in the 70s. But the fact that it's been reported long before then and they made the movie because of the reports, lends more credence to it as well. And like you were talking about with the whole Bigfoot phenomenon in general, people weren't aware of Bigfoot because you didn't have all the media and all the paranormal shows like we do now and movies about Bigfoot and that type of stuff. So the people just described what they saw. And the fact that it was so similar in their sightings, lends more credibility to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it establishes that while there's no solid proof, it does show that something strange has been seen there that people couldn't explain. And these people that live down there in the Sulphur River bottoms, a lot of the sightings were by people that lived in rural environments. They were familiar with bears and cougars and, whatever that lives down there. They would not be prone to see some wildlife and mistake it for, some upright, hair-covered ape-like creature. And
Right.
so that kind of also, it's not city people going into the woods. These were people who, lived there for many generations. So if they said they saw something they couldn't identify, then, that carries some weight.
Yeah, and you've investigated some other reports of a similar creature also in Missouri called the Momo.
Right. Yeah. The Missouri monster, which the newspapers abbreviated to MOMO, MO for Missouri, and monster. That was another case that was reported around the same time as the Legend of Boggy Creek came out in the papers, so the early 70s, and it was kind of a similar situation where a very small town, and this was located in the town called Louisiana, Missouri. That's not confusing enough, but that's in the far eastern portion of the state along the Mississippi River. And people in this small town began to see a similar type creature, kind of an unkempt, upright, hairy biped that got newspaper coverage, and kind of there was a frenzy going on in the town, and some kids had seen this thing out in their backyard, which butts up against a place called Marzoff Hill, very rugged area, and it was just so similar to Legend of Boggy Creek, except nobody had made a famous movie. So I definitely loved that case as well and wanted to cover that in some fashion. And so that ended up doing a book on that.
Doing the research for your book with both of the legends and the monsters, there's a lot of places where a lot of Bigfoot sightings happen. Like I live in Tennessee, so like in East Tennessee in the Smoky Mountains, you have a lot of sightings out there, and a lot of reports over, go back hundreds of years as well. But there's also a cluster of like missing people in that same area and other phenomena. So did you find any of that with these two cases, that there's other phenomena kind of clustered in the area as far as the paranormal goes, or just other weird disappearances or anything like that?
In the case of the Boggy Creek monster, I haven't gotten a lot of, other bizarre things. Occasionally somebody reports something, but in the case of Momo, the Missouri monster, there were a lot of other strange things that were going on at the same time, which included sightings of strange lights in the sky. There was even a few UFO sightings. There were very bizarre noises coming out of the woods, guttural growls and metallic noises, and what people described as disembodied voices. So Momo, and in fact, the Momo case was originally mostly investigated by UFO investigators, the early incarnation of MUFON, because back in the early 70s, you didn't have a lot of Bigfoot researchers or cryptid researchers, So since there had been some reports of lights in the sky and things, they came in, and of course theories were proposed that the creature had come from a UFO, and even though they could have just been coincidental, nobody saw, the creature exiting a craft or any such thing.
Right.
But it's just one of those standout cases, and of the few where you have a flap of Bigfoot sightings, and then you also have, some other weird paranormal things going on at the same time. So very interesting case.
Yeah, and the paranormal world is kind of split down the middle when it comes to cryptids and other paranormal phenomena. And you got the camp that believes that you're looking at either aliens or interdimensional beings, and then you have people like you that believe these cryptids really exist. What do you think about the division between the two camps and researching these things and actually going out and talking to people about them?
Well, I can certainly see how they can be lumped together. I mean, just sort of under the umbrella of paranormal or high strangeness. But to me, having investigated a lot of Bigfoot cases and phenomenon over the years, I don't see much connection between, say, UFOs and Bigfoot. I get that question all the time, but the descriptions of Bigfoot and Bigfoot itself is so much of a terrestrial-based thing. I mean, it's very compared to being man-like. It walks upright. They're seen in wooded environments or places where there's waterways, places where logically, if a creature like that existed, that they would be. UFOs could be seen over your city, but you're not seeing Bigfoots running down the street. I just don't see that. And you can look at 100,000 Bigfoot reports and you'd find maybe 50 of them at best that say anything about a UFO. So some of those are, those are the rare parts of it. So I don't see those two as linked, other than some of us who may be interested in one of those phenomenons will also be interested in UFOs and ghosts and all things weird. As far as disappearances, you're certainly right. There's been a few cases in the Smoky Mountains where there's been Bigfoot sightings over the years in those areas, and there's also been some rather, unsettling and strange disappearances. So whether those are connected, again, it's impossible to say. I do have a case that occurred in, I want to say, 1976 in Tennessee, where a Bigfoot-like creature tried to grab a kid in his backyard there in Tennessee.
Wow.
And so there's one where you connect sort of like, well, maybe these creatures would take a kid. And then I think it's the Dennis Martin case in Smoky Mountains where that kid disappeared. And one of the witnesses said they saw what looked like maybe a wild person or something. So who knows?
Yeah, and there's some other phenomena that you have investigated. One of them, you wrote another book called Sinister Swamps, and it's kind of the high strangeness of swamps in general. What made you want to write that book, and why do you think swamps tend to be a place where all this high strangeness and ghosts and cryptids and all this stuff kind of occurs?
Well, I kind of like the monster thing. I've always loved swamps. It just kind of has that spooky intrigue, and when I was a kid, I know what I mean. If you watched Scooby-Doo episodes or monster movies, they're always, in a swamp, and it just seemed like a cool, spooky place. So, over the years, I've found myself, like with the Beast of Boggy Creek or the Lizard Man case in South Carolina, where I'm investigating a well-known cryptid incident, and it happens to be near a swamp. So I thought, well, these swamps seem to have an unusual amount of strange stuff, so that would make a great book, is to kind of go and look at these swamps where there's all sorts of things. And that was sort of a geographically based research. And instead of focusing on any one creature, it was more like, okay, here's the Dismal Swamp, or here's Hockomock Swamp or Honey Island Swamp, and just talk about all the legends and all the strange things that may have been reported, which could include not only Bigfoots or cryptids like pterosaurs and black cats, and to obviously ghosts and haunted type things and spook lights, disappearances, any number of stuff. So it was a fun one to write. It took me many years to compile all the research, and like in many of my books, I go to the location so that I can sort of bring that firsthand description to the readers. So that one took a while to get finished.
Yeah, and like you said, seeing swamps and Scooby-Doo and some of the horror movies, and yeah, they just have this kind of energy about them, this air about them that just make them kind of creepy. And I think part of it is because a lot of the swamps and stuff are unexplored and people don't really live there, so it has this mystique and intrigue, and then you get these stories of experiences that people have had, and I think it just adds to it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and again, it's like some of what remains is the most inaccessible portions of North America, and if there are creatures that are sort of few and far between off the grid, these are the places they're going to live. They're going to live in the mountains. They're going to live in the swamps. They're going to live in larger tracts of forestry there are. So it's just a natural kind of place where it would be a conducive home to the unknown.
And there's another case that you investigated kind of close to your neck of the woods in Texas, the Lake Worth monster.
Yeah, that's another really cool one. And in fact, I interviewed a guy yesterday who had seen me on some reruns of Monsters and Mysteries in America, who had been there when this case kind of came up. And this one primarily is dated to the summer of 1969, Lake Worth is located near Fort Worth, Texas, kind of in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And back in 1969, it was very heavily wooded out there. And, there was kind of some lover's lane and gravel roads, and kids would go out there to drink and things. And on one evening, some couples were parked out there, and they said that some sort of bizarre creature tried to attack them or get in the car. They described it as being whitish or maybe having white hair, and it seemed to walk upright. And, the description kind of crossed into what the term goat man or goat men, and it was although it was sort of a Bigfoot type description. But anyway, that case is one that has kind of become the legends of lore of Texas, the Lake Worth monster. And I still, like I say, I still get reports, and this guy said he had been there right in the heyday of that stuff in '69. And while they didn't get a very clear sighting, they saw a large upright silhouette of something in the moonlight between the trees one evening. And, that corresponded with, other reports of the time. So, it was just a regular old guy who had an interesting story and, was definitely a credible type witness. So it's a good case.
Have there been lots of other reports or just mainly those few?
There was some newspaper articles which were carried in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram back at that time, and then a woman named Sally Ann Clark actually wrote an independent book called The Lake Worth Monster, and she fielded quite a few reports, probably 15 or 20 at the time, and then I've kind of uncovered others. Most of it was concentrated in that time, and then it kind of dissipated on into the 70s. But occasionally there's been some that occurred after that as far into the 80s where people in that area had reported like a Bigfoot-like creature. So I've, kind of just like any of these other cases, I'll occasionally get reports and kind of add those to the catalog.
And so in all your years of investigating all of this phenomenon, high strangeness, what kind of experiences have you had with the kind of paranormal world and high strangeness? And have you ever come into contact with any Bigfoot type creatures or any other cryptids?
Well, I've never actually seen, something I would definitively say is a Bigfoot or a cryptid, but there has been a few times where I've been in these areas in the woods and, felt that I could have been close. One of those occasions I was in the swamp area called Mercer Bayou, south of Falk, Arkansas, the Boggy Creek area, and heard something howling several times. And the howl was, myself and my research partner, who was quite experienced woodsman, just couldn't identify it. And whatever this was followed us down the bayou and got up really near our camp and howled at us just across the bayou channel. And that was, kind of pretty scary. I'm not usually scared in the woods, but the realization that something's following you and it's howling and it's unidentified. I tried to get a flashlight and run down that embankment to see it, but whatever it was took off in the woods, and I just never got a sighting. A similar incident occurred in the Ocala National Forest in Florida when I was out there a couple of years ago. And in that case, I heard what sounded like something hitting a can in the middle of these, it was way out there in the woods, which was bizarre. And I ducked into the canopy and put the light trying to find it. But whatever this thing was just one step ahead. I'd move and it would move and I could hear it out there. And to me, it sounded like it was running on two legs and it was big. But again, I never could see it. So those are times when, I could have been close to a Bigfoot. And then, believe it or not, I've seen what I would call a ghost. Back when I was in high school, I was at a friend's house he had stories and said he and his family had seen a ghost, and a couple of my friends said they had seen it. But, I didn't, back then I kind of I wasn't like thinking as an investigator, so I just kind of, oh, okay, cool. But I was sitting there one night in his living room and I saw something walk across the entryway hallway, which looked like kind of what you would think a ghost looked like. It was about the size of a boy, and it was kind of a whitish figure. and it walked just, a second or two, poof, right across. And I was like, man, dude, I just saw, like, that's the ghost. He's like, oh, yeah, it goes right across there. I mean, he was very nonchalant about it, I guess, because they had seen it. But, to me, I was like, wow, that is freaky.
So with all the reports that you've taken of these creatures, and with most of them being Bigfoot, Sasquatch type creatures, why do you think that we've never been able to, have more evidence or find a body or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly an issue as we go on, that we still don't have a body, at least a body that's been made public in any sort of definitive proof. But, it's not out of the question if these creatures are more intelligent, or if they have the wherewithal to hide, to bury their dead, or to, not just fall over where they lie, or and just the rarity of them. I know it seems like there's Bigfoot sightings all over the place everywhere, but when you really get down to it, if you distill out the ones that are fairly unmistakable, that this person saw something very clearly that he can't identify, these creatures are just few and far between, and that makes it much harder to find one. You can use the comparison that some northern states, Washington State or whatever, there might be 25,000 bears, but if you go walking around, you're a hunter, your chances of even finding the body of a dead bear is, very slim. And so if you say, well, there could be a viable population of 250 Sasquatch, what do you think the chances are you're going to find the bones of one of those? Almost nil. So that doesn't excuse it, but that does kind of give a perspective on it's just not as easy to find a dead animal as one would think. And then down in the South, or up in the mountains, there's miles of forestry. That if that body sits there for several weeks, it's just going to, be scavenged, and then it will disappear back into the earth and never to be found. And that's not to say that some hunter hasn't come across a body, but it was somewhat decomposed. Maybe he thought it was a bear or a hog or something else, and just, he was going to go over there and start messing with a dead corpse, unless he really thought it could be a Bigfoot. Otherwise, so it could very well be that somebody's walked right past one and just didn't realize.
Yeah, and then when having, plenty of scavengers out in the woods, I'm sure it would be quick to be scattered, bones and everything to be scattered and picked through. And
surely, and I mean, we don't have any fossil record of these creatures, but in the fossil record, we're also very short of other, even great apes. There's just not a lot, in some cases, no evidence. So not having the fossil record doesn't rule out that they could be here, because, again, they're few and far between and rare, and the earth is a big place with a lot of foliage and trees and rocks and places where bones and bodies can be elusive.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think it's just some undiscovered primate that's extremely intelligent, for one, and maybe they do bury their dead, like you were saying. If they're intelligent enough, maybe that's something that they do. And also, like you were saying, there's millions of acres of forest, and you don't have mass amounts of people going out into these areas. And if they're smart enough, they're gonna stay away from where people are in these areas anyway.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And there's theories, and everybody's theory is valid of other ways to explain why we don't have one, but there's certainly validity in that it could be a biological species, and we just simply haven't had the good luck to find it, to prove it. Obviously, they're having better luck because we're not running over them with trucks or what have you.
Right, yeah.
It's great for people's enthusiasm to want to search for these creatures, but I get pictures of all, here's a footprint, the many that I see, there is a few that I think, now that is something I can't explain in that circumstance, and that looks like a print. A lot of the others are double bear tracks, hog wallows, depressions in the road. There's all sorts of other stuff that look enticing, but when you kind of get down to it, again, it just shows you that these creatures are more rare and they're few and far between, and not so easy to, just not that easy to get evidence or to prove.
Yeah. So you put out a couple of books last year in 2020. So what do you have coming up for 2021?
Yeah, it was a busy year, even though, with all the craziness and the shutdowns and stuff, I guess I'd done a lot of research, so I was able to finish up the Sinister Swamps and all that, so that was cool. This year, I'm kind of just looking at some topics for books and taking some time to see where cases and research lead me, because that's always a good flow of how something comes in where I think it might be interesting to turn it into a book. We'll be narrating a new small town monsters film called Howl of the Rougarou, which is going to deal with sightings and traditions of a werewolf-like creature in the Louisiana Bayou Cajun country area. That's always kind of in my zone of cool stuff, Southern, and of course, talking about dogmen, werewolves. So those are always fun to do. And then other than that, there's starting to be a few events where we can get back and do, get together and then do some conferences of cryptids and things like that. So I have a few things lined up, whereas last year a lot of things got canceled.
Yeah.
And I do like to get out there and speak at events and meet people, and it's a great way to network and to talk with people like-minded. I get, often find great witness reports from those things. So hopefully this year things will ramp back up, and I'm going to do some research here pretty soon. I'm headed to Falk, and then I'm headed to Florida to do some research out there. So get a little traveling going.
And like I said at the beginning of the show, they can find all your stuff at lyleblackburn.com.
Yes. Yeah, all the links would be there. And, my books are available on Amazon from hardback, paperback, Kindle. And then if you would like to view some of the Small Town Monsters movies, you can check those out on Amazon Prime Video. And, just hit lyleblackburn.com, and it's got all the latest info.
All right. Well, I thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me today, Lyle. It's been awesome. It's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed it. Absolutely. Yeah, it was good times. Thanks for having me on. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. And as always, stay safe out there. We'll see you next time. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, check us out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or at our website, unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And don't forget to like, review, rate, and share with all your friends. Thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. Listen to our theme song and more of his music at chrislipsmusic.com. And remember, some of the scariest things are unseen.